Welcome to this week's episode of the InfoSec and Ozone Show. I'm Josh Amishav. This week I have a great conversation with Dr. Martina Dove. Martina is a researcher specializing in fraud psychology, meaning what causes people to fall for scams, as well as the persuasion techniques commonly used. My three main takeaways from our conversation were: 1, what makes certain people more susceptible to fraud; 2, the techniques scammers use to convince us or trick us to take certain actions; and 3, which influence factor is the most powerful. You'll enjoy those two things, plus a bunch of other tips along the way. And now, here's my conversation with Martina. Martina Dove, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So can you tell us who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently working as a UX researcher, which is a user experience researcher. I work for Tripwire, which is a cybersecurity company. But my background is typically, what I did for my PhD was around human factors in fraud. So anything from personal characteristics that make us vulnerable to fraud to, how scammers persuade us, what techniques they use and stuff like that.
So very useful techniques for anybody who is doing any social engineering, or perhaps for everybody else who needs to defend against that.
Yes.
Awesome. So how did you get into studying fraud?
Yeah, so I did an interesting project for my master's thesis, which was on the Barnum effect. And the Barnum effect it's a cognitive bias, and it's to do with how people accept vague feedback. And this is kind of really interesting because it can be applied to some frauds, such as anywhere where you get some kind of personal feedback. So tarot reading, clairvoyancy, stuff like that. And it's basically how you can present a feedback which is very vague, that applies to many people, and make it seem that it's very accurate. And after the person accepts this very vague but accurate feedback, they kind of like have more trust in you. So anything you say is going to come out as very trustworthy. So I got really interested in that. And then I was thinking I wanted to do something for my PhD and I didn't really know what. And I came across this really interesting article which talked about what psychology is used in phishing emails. And I was like, yes, this is so cool. I want to do this. I want to kind of go deeper into that and understand what makes people fall for fraud. Are there any other factors? Is it just the psychology? Is it something on their part in terms of the circumstances? So really this kind of, that article really sparked my imagination. And that's how I ended up kind of like pivoting into fraud, where at the beginning of my PhD, I was thinking more about researching gullibility and understanding what it is and stuff like that.
Okay, so now you've piqued my interest. So when you get like the psychic who gives you vague but accurate prediction, what is it about our psychology that makes us believe that?
Yeah, so for example, you can. I don't think it's that much about our psychology. It's just how our brain works, really, in terms of you hear a statement that can apply to you, which seems really accurate, and you just think, yeah. And then based on that statement, if you think about how we trust people, right? So if people are kind of giving us something that seems trustworthy, we're going to extend that trust a little bit further, based on what they've told us.
Do you have an example of like a vague but specific statement?
Yeah, of course. So, for example, the psychologist that came out with this was called, I think his name was something Forer. So Forer did an experiment where he took statements from daily horoscopes. So there are things like security is very important to you, right? Security is important to everyone, right? Like really, there's not a person, or like if you're an extreme sort of like risk-taking person, then maybe security is not, important to you. But for most people, security is important to them. Or you can say a statement such as, you can be outgoing, but at other times you're a little bit more reserved. I mean, that goes for everyone, right? In different situations, we behave differently. So stuff like that, stuff that cancels each other, or stuff that is kind of just like incredibly universally valid. You appreciate artistic things in life, just like very, very vague, but very accurate statements of majority of people. And then based on those statements as well, if you really keep the statements positive, people tend to accept extreme positive statements a little bit more readily than a negative statement. So if you kind of keep the feedback on a positive, such as, you're the most popular person your friends know, you're really kind. Everybody wants to think of themselves as this. So again, you accept those positive things about you more readily, and that's to do with how our self-esteem works, right? In order for us to go through life and have a good self-esteem, we see ourselves in positive light. So people can exploit us by being positive and flattering towards us.
That's really interesting. A lot of us think we're too clever to fall for a scam. What makes certain people more susceptible to certain types of fraud?
I would say first and foremost, believing that you wouldn't be scammed. I think that's the big one, because I think it lowers the risk perception, and it lowers the curiosity to research something. And I found this in my studies. Actually, I did an experimental study where, I developed my own measure of fraud susceptibility, and people who had, like I call that factor belief in justice, but it was really about believing that the police would be there if you were defrauded. So, you'll be taken care of. Fraud will be prosecuted and punished. This wouldn't happen to you. It only happens to some people who are gullible. So people who kind of like think of themselves as secure should fraud happen, or they think of themselves in terms of, this wouldn't happen to me because I'm intelligent. And I've heard a lot of fraud victims tell me this. I never thought this would happen to me because I'm a fairly intelligent person. But fraud has nothing to do with intelligence. It has a lot to do with how skillful the scammer is at mimicking what's accepted of other companies or things we've seen. It's a lot to do about psychology and exploiting errors in judgment that we're prone to as humans, right? So it's really nothing to do with how intelligent you are. So I would say first and foremost that, and then compliance, impulsivity, all of those things are gonna have an impact in terms of how likely are you to go along with something, or how quickly you will go along with something.
Right. So, compliance meaning you can use like authority to force somebody to make a certain decision.
Not even just authority, but yeah, you're right. Being more compliant to authority, but also being more compliant in general. Are you somebody who goes along with their friends and family, or if there's a stronger personality, do you just go along with that person? Even though like you think there may be something wrong with it. So compliance, it's very different to being agreeable, and it's different in terms of, it's slightly different because a lot of the times compliant individuals understand there's something wrong with it, but it's stronger than them. They like just comply because that's who they are. It's easier for them to comply than maybe argue against something. So obviously that's going to be a big factor. And like another one that comes to mind is how vigilant you are. So are you somebody who is kind of like more skeptical about things that happen, and like tend to check things out before making firm decisions? So there's kind of a lot of little tiny things. There's also as well the circumstances you're in. So, like those, I found that can make a big difference to how likely you are to go along with frauds.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So, for example, if you are, if you're not financially stable, right? So this is kind of like a fundamental need. You're in distress because maybe your finances are not where you want them to be, or you're struggling financially, or you don't have a job. You will look at the certain opportunities, like investment opportunities, and think, I'll take a gamble on that. Whereas if you were in a stable job and you didn't really have a financial need, it would be a little bit more of a risk to you to risk something you already have to gain something. Whereas when you have less of that, you're more likely to just risk it. I've seen these situations many times in other things as well. For example, people who are in physical pain may kind of like invest money in miracle cures that they don't maybe fully believe in, but because they haven't found anything to address their needs and their pain, they're more likely to see if something will work. So it definitely, certain circumstances can lower our risk perception. Another example is if you're in a group of friends who all are going along with something, so social proof, you're more likely to go along with your friends even though you think there's something maybe wrong. So it takes a strong person to then say no to something.
Interesting. So if you look at the different types of popular scams, right? So you got like the Nigerian scams, got romance scams, phishing scams. Are there any commonalities between all the different types of scams?
Yes and no. I think they all have a way they persuade. But even just if you take just a Nigerian scam, as you said, Nigerian scams, I've seen many different variants of them, and they don't all use the same persuasion techniques. So they're very, very different in how they present. So you have the ones that appeal to our social norms, such as, hey, help this person in need, get money out of this country, or you have them in terms of, hey, this is just a business deal. If you do this for me, I will do this for you, you'll get a certain cut. So the way they appeal to you is slightly different. There are the ones where there's like they're presented more as a business deal. They're the ones that kind of look for different things, and they're the ones that actually look for certain news that are happening in the world and attach themselves to that. So they spin a story around. So I've seen a lot of them. I've seen a lot of Nigerian type scams kind of dress themselves around war in Syria, for example. When there was in the news, they come around when there are natural disasters that people are maybe fundraising for. So you need to kind of like look at scams in terms of they're constantly evolving. They definitely do have their own markers. Like romance scams have certain things, and romance scams have certain things for men and for women specifically. So they differ in a way how they orchestrated against men and orchestrated against women. There's always outliers, but like there are differences in how they kind of persuade.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into the persuasion. How does, let's say, in the romance scams or
Mhm.
any of the scams, what kind of persuasion techniques are commonly used?
Yeah, so like the biggest one I've seen that kind of enhances credibility is the reciprocity. So a scammer may actually, when they're kind of executing a well-executed romance scams, they will invest some money to groom the victim. So they may actually send some gifts in the beginning. They may send flowers. They may send small tokens. And these gifts have a dual purpose. First of all, it makes the victim feel that this is a legitimate person who's interested in them. And then it also primes the victim to return the favor down the line, because it's kind of ingrained in us. When people do us favors, we feel obliged to return those favors. And so giving something to someone early on, make sure that when you ask for money later on, the victim will feel more uncomfortable saying no, because you already done something for them. So that's a big one in romance scams. Like another things, other things that scammers do in romance scams is they will orchestrate scam in a way that adds legitimacy to it. So they may kind of like bring other people into it. So, for example, just to give you a solid example, a lot of the times when the victim says no to giving money, let's say that a love prospect has said, "Oh, I was in a car crash and I need money for medical bills," right? And the victim sort of goes, "Well, there's a lot of money, I don't know what I would want to do here." Suddenly, a third person calls the victim and says, "I'm a doctor. Your love interest is about to die, and we just don't have the funds to continue the treatment," right? And this is kind of like that builds the sort of more. It gives the scam credibility and legitimacy, and a victim will feel this is a credible situation. Now a doctor's calling me, and then when we have certain people kind of approach us, such as doctors, lawyers, police, that's again is we exploiting, the scammers are exploiting like, I don't know if it's a persuasion technique, but it does come down to authority. Certain professions are more trusted. So we trust people in certain professions that signify ethics, that signify help, such as police officers, such as lawyers, and that will have an impact in how we're persuaded to go along with things.
Okay, and in the Nigerian scams, they bring in third parties as well, or how does that? Because when I think of Nigerian scams, and this is kind of what I'm getting at, I always think of the emails with lots of grammar mistakes, spelling mistakes, and they seem very obvious. And I think, okay, what kind of persuasion techniques are used there for them to be successful?
Yeah, so I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So yes, they do use authority, and they always have either a bank official that is kind of from a bank, so somebody who is authorized to make the transaction. And then if you engage with a scam, quite often they will bring another person in who is a lawyer, who will get you to sign some documents to make it feel like it's credible. But one of the things that you mentioned, like you touch on in terms of that they're really badly spelled out. One of the hypotheses now is that Nigerian scams, because they're so well known and because they kind of like have these spelling mistakes and everybody kind of knows them and laughs about them, there is a hypothesis that they more strategically sent, not specifically to catch, people in scams, but to identify who is a good target. So getting to the most vulnerable people, and then the details of those people are then sold on. Because if you fall for a Nigerian scam that looks ludicrous and it's so obvious and it has spelling mistakes and it's just ridiculous, then it's very very high likelihood that you will fall for anything else. So the details of such people are really valuable to scammers.
Are there any stats available for, like, let's say, take the romance scams? Are men more likely or women more likely to fall for these, and how much money is lost on average in these scams?
Yeah, there is some research out there that looked at kind of like how the romance scams are executed. And typically, women tend to lose bigger amount of money, but you have to groom them for longer. And when they lose money, they lose a big chunk of money, whereas men tend to get defrauded over smaller amounts of money. So typically how fraud works for women, there will be somebody who will groom them over a period of months, make them believe they're going to get married, there's future there, and sort of. And then typically some kind of a big disaster will happen in terms of the love prospect will be in a car crash, or they'll have to pay some money for the business deal just to get. So you kind of like, but because you already know there's a future in there with you two, you feel like you're doing this as a future kind of thing. Whereas men tend to be approached by younger women who are usually single mothers in poorer countries. And typically men will be asked to buy a plane ticket. So they may get defrauded over money for a plane ticket, and when a person doesn't appear, they'll cut ties and move on. And they may get defrauded again and again over smaller amounts, such as kind of, just plane tickets and stuff like that. Having said that, I don't like to generalize, because I think scammers are very good at figuring out what type of person you are and spinning a scam. Like I've heard of men being defrauded in the same way that women are, in a long-term, kind of being in a long-term relationship with somebody who is somewhere else, and then kind of sending them money on a regular sort of basis. So I don't like to generalize. I think scammers are very good at kind of like starting one thing and then evolving as they see how you react to it.
Interesting. Are there any common, I guess, from the victim standpoint, common decision-making processes that we all use throughout the various scams?
Yeah, like one thing, I always say, one thing that I've heard from all of the victims that I've interviewed with is typically I thought I was smart and this wouldn't happen to me. So it's just kind of like this bias that we see ourselves in a positive light, we see ourselves as intelligent, and because of that, we think we wouldn't fall for something. And people a lot of the times don't actually take the time to research any fraud warnings until it's applicable to them, right? So they don't actually know how sophisticated scammers are. They have this notion that scams are obvious and you would know. And if you weren't greedy, you wouldn't fall for a scam. I still hear this, oh yeah, like people were just greedy. Well, when you're giving money to a fake crowdfunding sort of campaign, you're not greedy, you're nice, so like I think it's that kind of like thinking, old-fashioned thinking of what scam used to be, right? Like it's just investment scams where you're getting gains quickly. So just being aware of that, being aware of our own capabilities and intelligence, and it has nothing to do with intelligence, but a lot of the times as well on the internet, we can't really tell who the person is as accurately as in person. So we're not picking up on body language. We're not picking up on some cues that are available to us in a social setting. So I would say like the biggest one is that. The second biggest one, maybe just being impulsive, kind of not thinking things through, kind of acting based on superficial cues. And what I mean by that, focusing on how charming the scammer is, how flattering the person is, and forgetting about the facts that they're giving us, if that makes sense. So kind of focusing on more peripheral information. Is the person telling us this well dressed? Is the person telling us this well spoken? All of these things make up our minds, but they're not really important. They can kind of mask the facts.
So pay attention to the fact that you are making a decision based on the way somebody talks or looks, as opposed to their actions. Is that what you should focus on?
Yeah, I would say pay attention to what they say and not how they say it, and how you're feeling about them. Right? I know this is really difficult because we all kind of click with some people, and scammers are very good at kind of like mimicking what they do. So they're going to appear even more similar to us. So just pay attention to what they're telling us, cross-check the information being given, focus on the facts rather than how these facts are presented.
Now, how do you deal with that when it's like, if you look at like fake news, which manipulates public opinion? I see family members who will post on various social media, I do not wish Facebook to take my data, or things along like that, and they don't fact check to see if that's even valid. How is that so successful?
Yeah. So, okay. Yes, I've seen that. It drives me nuts. So that's a prime example of when people don't just even do the basics of checks, right? Like just put it in a Google and you'll see that I don't even think that it's a scam. I think it's just a hoax, it's just kind of like getting people to do.
But it works so well at persuading people. It's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. I wonder whether, there's a motive in there as well that I haven't figured out yet. But basically, I think one of the things, how you can explain that is by looking at humans as social animals, right? We're social. We shape our world based on how others are behaving around us, right? So before the internet, we would typically be confined in our like a social circle or environment. Maybe our countries would have and they still do have very cultural and societal norms that are kind of everybody abides by. They're not legal kind of laws. Then they just things that we learn from very early age. But we typically look at others to define our reality. So when other people are posting these hoax things, we think it's valid because a friend has posted it, right? And we trust that friend. So this social kind of influence then carries, and people kind of just propagate this kind of like fake news because to them it's not fake news. It came from a friend. So it's credible. Do you see what I mean? So it's kind of like attaching this idea of credibility just because your friend sort of posted this. So yeah, this can be explained by the social influence and how we, kind of like how we define our reality in terms of we look to our friends to define whether what we're doing is normal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so then how do you go a couple of months back with let's say, scarcity and toilet paper during the height of COVID? How do we, from a psychological standpoint, combat that to kind of get a reality check or not to deal with those social pressures?
Yeah, so scarcity is actually nothing to do with the social pressure. It's another persuasion technique. When something is scarce, um, first and foremost, it becomes like a social like symbol. But definitely, you can apply the toilet paper shortage to a social influence too. But scarcity on top of them will make it even more influential because when something is difficult to get, we value it more, and you see that in terms of like not just kind of like in terms of things we can purchase, but in terms of relationships. We always like people that are difficult to get, right? We're always more interested in them because any kind of like attention that we get seems to be amplified and seems to be really important. And the same with things like if we can't buy something easily and it's not easily available, first of all, we want it more because now it's kind of like there's a status that not everybody can get this, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is that we are prepared to risk more for these items or things. We are prepared to pay more for these items. So kind of like that on its own is a very influential persuasion technique, very much used in marketing, very much used by companies that are legitimate, that sell things legitimately, just kind of like for example, if you're going on a website and you're purchasing something and it says hurry, only one left in stock, I'm pretty sure they just don't have one left in stock. But by thinking that you may kind of like miss out on something, just gets you kind of feeling really. And then on top of that, you're seeing people in the sort of toilet paper shortage. You see your friends and family doing that. You see your neighbors like hoard piling. You see other people in the supermarket doing this. So there is a component of social influence there too, as well as the scarcity. So like if you think of like sort of these techniques and heuristics, the more there's to it, the more powerful they are. So when there's just one thing, it's powerful. But when there's one and the other, it's more powerful. When there's three of them, it's even more powerful on how you're going to react to it. So it's kind of, yeah. And to be honest with you, I've said this to somebody else I gave a podcast to. I'm a psychologist and I know all of this. And when there was shortage, I had enough toilet paper because I tend to go to Costco once a year and stock on that, and it's just in my garage. But I went shopping and I found like one or two on a shelf and I bought one. And I came home and my husband said to me, "Why did you buy toilet paper? We had lots in a garage. We have enough for a year or so." And I was like, "But like, there was just two left. I had to do it." There was something stronger than me. But that just like I'm able to actually see how powerful these psychological effects are on us.
Which persuasion technique from like Cialdini do you think is the most effective?
Ooh, that's interesting. I personally don't think there's a super strong one because we're all different. So people who, for example, if you have been brought up to respect authority more, then authority will actually be something that's more kind of influential to you. If you have been sort of brought up as somebody who came to value certain things that are scarce, right? Or like social symbols in terms of like fashion or items, right? If you are that sort of a person, then obviously scarcity of a certain item may have something, like a greater hold over you. So I think it's complicated to say just isolate just one. If you're more of an extrovert, then obviously social influence will be more important to you than to an introvert. So I kind of like feel it's a kind of very delicate combination of personality factors and kind of hitting the right person with the right like persuasion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you're like a offensive social engineer, you'd have to figure out your target's, I'd say, weak points to figure out how to compose your message to them to get the most effect.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think most scammers cast a wide net, but I think the good scammers will have several different layers, like several sort of persuasion techniques. One of the big one, which isn't Cialdini, but it is like something that scammers frequently use, is evoking, kind of a primal drives. So evoking sort of visceral influence. And those primal drives are very, very strong. And these primal drives are like hunger, thirst, greed, sexual desire, fear. It's varied, and even there, it's kind of like very targeted in terms of that. Some people are more fear averse, and some people can tolerate quite a lot of fear, and even like it. Like extreme sports, right? There are people who love extreme sports, which would terrify most people, right? So, like, for example, if that person gets a sextortion email that says, hey, you were caught doing these things on camera, pay this ransom, they may not really be that concerned. But to somebody else who is fear averse, this will seem very huge because they are just going to be more worked up about it in terms of like fear. So I just think the same with persuasion techniques. I think it's kind of, it depends who you are and what your makeup is in terms of your personality, your circumstances. It's very individual how you're going to react to things. And I would say even circumstances can make you vulnerable to one thing at one time, but not at another.
So it's really all about timing as well.
Yeah, it's all about timing and your circumstances. I mean, sometimes you may be like, for example, you may be without a job, so you're going to risk things. But at another time, the same scam will come to you and you have a good job and you don't have any need to risk your income to get something on top of it. So it's kind of like it's complicated. I like to say to people, it's complicated.
Do you have any tips for somebody who wants to learn more about this field of fraud, social engineering?
Yeah, there are lots of really good articles out there. And there's also my book. I try to kind of put it all together in my book so that somebody can just pick up one thing, and read everything there is. Well, not everything there is, but a lot of how it all ties together. And
who's the target audience for your book?
I wrote this book first and foremost for general audience, but it is backed up by academic sources and literature. So it's a good read for anybody who just wants to know about credible facts that have been found on this topic. It's also a good book in terms of the, like I've heard a lot of law prevention people, kind of like a scam prevention people who work within a law, kind of organization say that it's a good book for them. It's a good manual to kind of understand what's happening. And also, like I've heard a lot of academics come back to me and say, I'm teaching this in my class. So I would say it's a really good book for everyone. I wrote it in a way that's easy to understand it. So it's not your typical academic textbook. So like it's relatively easy to read, but I backed it up with sources. So should you wish to read more on certain things, you can easily find those.
Awesome. What's the book called?
The book is called The Psychology of Fraud, the persuasion techniques. I don't even know. It's like such a long title. But the
Psychology of Fraud, Persuasion, and Scam Techniques.
What makes us vulnerable? The titles are always negotiation with your publisher, because they like to hit as many words as keywords, like when they marketing the book. But The Psychology of Fraud, it's basically about everything that can make us vulnerable to fraud offers.
Awesome. All right. And if folks want to follow you, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so I have a Twitter account. I post things on my Twitter account, and my Twitter account, I'm pretty active. You can always email me there. You can, add me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a website. You can always email me through my website as well.
Awesome. All right, Martina, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks again for listening and for leaving reviews. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. I'm @Jamus on Twitter, or drop me an email at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you're part of a security team that needs visibility into your employees, customers, or third-party suppliers' breach credentials before criminals exploit them, head on over to breachsense.io to apply for a free 7-day trial. That's it for this week, and I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.